El mundo en guerra.
The world at war. The attacks by the US armed forces against Venezuela marked the beginning of an armed conflict on the last continent that had remained free of wars until now, the American continent. From this point on, all major continents are experiencing ongoing wars: Europe, Asia, Africa, and America. What factors are driving this proliferation of conflicts? Which actors are involved? What interests lie behind all this? The world at war. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning from Berlin, Germany. We begin broadcast number 304 of Demolishing Myths Talks. Thank you very much for joining us, and please remember to support us with a thumbs up, as well as through subscriptions, memberships, which we reactivated a few days ago, and of course through our PayPal account. Joining us today, on this Saturday, is Mr. Juan Antonio Aguilar from Madrid. Juan Antonio, how are you? Everything all right over there?
Juan Antonio Aguilar desde Madrid. Juan Antonio, ¿qué tal todo por ahí?
¿Qué tal? Muy bien.
How are you? Very well. I mean, today my being here is a bit unusual, but you know I couldn't be here yesterday, so we had to move it to Saturday because I had a conference in Valladolid on the topic "They're Taking Us to War," organized by the Internationalist Assembly of Valladolid, to whom I'm grateful for the invitation. And well, it went really well.
Well, that's precisely the topic of this broadcast. The world at war, and to a large extent Europe, rapidly heading toward war. How about we first show the footage of this week's big development? The capture of a cargo ship off the Venezuelan coast. A cargo ship belonging to the so-called Shadow Fleet, Venezuelan or Iranian, although if I remember correctly, it was flying the flag of Guyana. Its operator is registered in Nigeria, and its owner in the Marshall Islands. Beyond that, with this action, a conflict begins directly, almost directly, beyond the 22 attacks, if I'm not mistaken, on boats off the coast of Venezuela. More than 80 dead. Well, now the capture of an oil tanker, a cargo ship full of crude departing from Venezuela. Also this, Juan Antonio, one of the many conflicts resolved by Donald Trump, 8, 9, 10, I can't even remember how many. The conflict between Cambodia and Thailand has restarted with fatalities, with images typical of open warfare. On the other hand, Ukraine and Russia, the negotiations, the back and forth, Zelensky in Europe rejecting the White House's proposal. In Africa, conflicts everywhere. War all over the world, Juan Antonio. Where do we begin the analysis?
Well, I think that if you take a look and realize what's happening in Sudan, what's happening in Syria, where once again we're seeing attacks, this time against American forces and the new Syrian regime in Palmyra, or what's happening in Cambodia and Thailand. Well, what does all this tell us? It tells us that conflicts, if not addressed at their deepest roots, are not resolved. No matter how much Mr. Trump goes out every day saying he's ended 8 wars, 12 wars, 25 wars, and so on, and that he should be given the Nobel Peace Prize and all that nonsense, reality eventually prevails. Conflicts have roots. That is to say, as we always say, a war begins long before the first shot is fired. And if the causes that lead to that conflict are not addressed, the war will remain there. There may be a ceasefire, a temporary pause because someone wants to flatter the president of the White House. Those things can happen, but they don't solve the conflict. In other words, at the slightest provocation, it resurfaces. And we see it in Cambodia, in Thailand, we see what's happening in Syria, we see what's been happening in Sudan for many months now, after it had also been halted by a ceasefire for a long time. That is to say, as for Ukraine, not even to mention it, because that's already an open war that won't stop with any ceasefire or with any nonsense Mr. Trump might say. So, well, what we see and what should make us reflect is that conflicts, wars begin long before the gunfire starts. I say this also in the context of the European question. There are those who think that, well, as long as we don't hear the cannons, we're not at war. No, we are already at war. That's the reality, the sad reality. There are people living in their own fantasy world thinking nothing is happening here, that everything is under control, and that the war is far away. Well, let them keep thinking that until the moment we crash into the wall and finally realize what reality looks like. The issue you brought up, the one about Venezuela, is another conflict. In this case, it's not Trump who stops it. Trump starts it. Trump provokes it. Why, possibly? Maybe because he handed the toy over to Marco Rubio, which is like giving a gun to a monkey. He starts shooting everywhere. But let's not fool ourselves. It's not just Marco Rubio, nor is it driven by that kind of reasoning. Last week we discussed how, in the new national security strategy published by the White House, the top priority among the strategic objectives for the upcoming U.S. period is control of the Western Hemisphere. That is, what they understand as the Western Hemisphere, meaning the Americas plus Greenland. And the idea was to bring back, to revive, to make relevant again the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine already comes from America for the North Americans. And well, how about the provocations? Because what the United States is fundamentally seeking is exactly that. To provoke an attack against an American ship, against an American plane, that would justify retaliatory actions and intervention, which is what they are aiming for. Because, since the excuse was drug trafficking, they targeted the boats of alleged traffickers. And we don't know whether they were carrying a few kilos of drugs, or smuggled gasoline, or if they were fishermen, or migrants trying to reach Puerto Rico. We don't know. Since they killed them all and destroyed the boats, we simply don't know. War crimes, plain and simple. Well, not even war crimes, just crimes. Because it also happened in international waters. They're not following maritime law. In other words, it's all quite despicable. What happened with the assault, which is an act of piracy, on the oil tanker that was supposedly carrying Iranian gasoline to refine Venezuelan oil? In short, their argument is based on the issue of sanctions.
Su argumento se basa en el tema de las sanciones. Pero claro, las sanciones unilaterales son ilegales.
Of course, unilateral sanctions are illegal under international law. Therefore, there is no justification for blocking or intercepting any ship from a country that has not been sanctioned in that regard by the United Nations Security Council. On the other hand, what we have witnessed has been an outright act of piracy. Article 101 of the Montego Bay Convention, that is, the one that regulates and defines what piracy is, states the following verbatim. Any illegal act of violence, detention, or depredation committed for private ends by the crew or passengers of a private ship or aircraft against another ship or aircraft on the high seas, or against persons or property on board or in a place not under the jurisdiction of any state. It also includes voluntarily taking part in the use of a pirate ship or inciting and facilitating such acts. Well, as we've seen, the U.S. military boards that ship, takes it over, diverts it, I think, to Puerto Rico, keeps the oil. I imagine they're not going to store the oil in barrels at the White House. It'll go to some private American oil company. I don't know what they'll do with it. Anyway, it's an act of piracy. I don't know. The international bodies, the United Nations, I don't know, its Secretary General. If he plans to do anything this time, that shameless man who earns a fortune for doing absolutely nothing. I don't know if he plans to act this time or if he'll once again limit himself to some statement or communique that the White House tenant will wipe his backside with.
Bien, pues esta está la situación. Esto que busca una
Well, this is the situation. This is just another attempt at provocation. That is, American planes are approaching the edge of Venezuelan territorial waters, looking for a provocation. That's what they're after, the casus belli that would justify an intervention, that would justify action against the Venezuelan leadership. That's what they're seeking, and that's how we have to understand it. For now, the Venezuelan government is pursuing a strategy of strategic patience, which I think is working quite well because they're holding firm. And what's becoming evident to the entire world is the criminal behavior of a criminal government, of a criminal state, namely the United States of America, the so-called greatest democracy in the world, and all those things they usually tell us. Well, this is the reality. People want to understand it that way. What do they want? To justify it? Do they want to justify this? Do they want to justify the extrajudicial killing of people traveling in a boat? What do they mean? Do they want to justify a Nobel Prize for a scoundrel who says he wants his country to be invaded? And what justifies these criminal acts? Our compatriots on both sides of the Atlantic, this is what they need to reflect on. This is what they need to reflect on. The United States of America can never be an ally, never a friend.
No puede ser nunca un aliado, nunca un amigo. Nunca. Porque esto que hoy le hacen a Venezuela.
Never. Because what they're doing to Venezuela today, tomorrow they'll do to any other country in the Americas, or to any European country if the occasion arises. No matter how much they claim to be allies, no matter how much they claim to be friends, no matter how much they claim to defend human rights, the UN Charter, and all the usual nonsense with which the ruling class of the Anglo-Saxon states seeks to dominate the world's resources, politics, culture, and nations. What? That we still have among our compatriots absolute fools who keep believing that the United States of America is the land of freedom, that they came to liberate Europe twice, that they bring development to the Americas. Please, how many more times? How many more things have to happen before everyone sees the evidence?
¿Cuántas cosas más tienen que pasar para que todo el mundo vea la evidencia? Recorran la historia del subcontinente americano.
Trace the history of the American subcontinent from the moment the Monroe Doctrine was applied, developed, and defined. How many interventions, invasions, coups d'etat, crimes, guerrillas, and terrorist groups has the United States used to dominate the subcontinent? 200 years enduring, elites subordinated to the Anglo-Saxon world, a century, the 20th century, and what we've lived of the 21st, enduring constant aggression, control, and the imposition of puppet governments. What more do we need? What has to happen for everyone, especially certain sectors of the right here in Spain and in the Americas, those who call themselves the right, who boast about their Hispanic identity, to finally understand that one cannot be friends with the United States, that it is a criminal regime.
Que es un régimen criminal. Sí, dentro podrán intentar justificar sus derechos.
Yes, inside they may try to justify themselves, talk about their rights and about being respectful of freedoms and whatever else they want. But outside, they only understand one language, the language of force, the language of resistance. Nothing more. There's nothing else. What we've seen this week, what we've been seeing over the past few weeks, is the objective, material, tangible evidence of what is clearly an imperialist attitude and foreign policy, which they even put in writing in official documents. We read it last Friday in the National Security Strategy, Priority, the Americas, the Western Hemisphere. They're going to seek domination. They will topple governments. They will carry out coups. They will assassinate leaders. Because that is their mark. That is their seal. They have no other. They have no other.
No tienen otro. No tienen otro. Primero fue desde Londres, ahora desde Washington.
First it was from London, now from Washington. Now they're fighting between London and Washington to see who comes out on top. And that's where we are. That's where we are in Europe. And that's where we are in the Americas. Thank God, in Asia, they're starting to shake off this horrible burden that throughout the whole unipolar movement had been imposed on all the peoples of the world. So, Well, nothing new, are idiots, and there are plenty of them. It's not just one more fool. Keep thinking that the United States is the land of promise, of freedom, and all that. Well, fine. I don't know, maybe they should try a bit of that medicine themselves, see how it feels. I don't know, maybe while paddling a canoe through the Caribbean and its beautiful beaches.
No sé, paseando a lo mejor con una canoa por el Caribe y sus hermosas playas.
Juan Antonio, desde hace algunos días, y más aún desde la publicación...
Juan Antonio, for the past few days, and even more so since the publication of this document on the US national strategy, both in the speeches of American and European state leaders and in major media outlets, a new narrative has begun to take shape. It's starting to look like one in which the sides are no longer the United States, Europe, and Ukraine on one side, and Russia on the other, but rather, apparently, Russia and the United States on one side, and Ukraine and Europe on the other. As an example of this, we can look at the words of
Ejemplo de esto, las palabras, por ejemplo, de Trump.
Leaders of France we spoke to.
Strong words supposedly in the discussions.
Fuertes palabras, supuestamente, en las discusiones. Por aquí, la contracara de esto, el semanario...
Here, the flip side of this, the weekly magazine Der Spiegel, with this cover. Two tyrants, one goal, how Trump and Putin attack Europe. Trump and Putin, Putin with a knife, a demonic face, and Trump above him smiling, both of them attacking Europe with the little flag of stars. In this current situation, Juan Antonio, with so many conflicts, so many new developments, so many realignments, could we be seeing the beginning of a shift towards something like this? A Europe facing another bloc formed by the United States and Russia.
Sí, otro bloque formado por Estados Unidos y Rusia. Recuerdo también ahora la propuesta del día de...
I also remember Donald Trump's proposal yesterday to leave the G7 and even the G20. He didn't take part in the last G20. Basically, Trump organized a plot against the G20 in South Africa, and now he's proposing the creation of a G5 instead of the G7, which would include the United States, China, Russia, India, and Japan, leaving out Europe. Are we really witnessing a realignment in this sense? Or are they once again putting on a fireworks show to ensure the continuity of the same old imperial policy, with NATO and the United States leading, and Europe following behind?
Imperial de toda la vida de la OTAN, con Estados Unidos a la cabeza y Europa detrás.
No, algo está pasando. Vamos a intentar analizarlo.
No, something's going on. Let's try to analyze it. Well, first of all, the cover of Der Spiegel is really infuriating, but let's see. Why did they make that cover? If they want to find a tyrant, they just have to look at their own prime minister, Friedrich Merz. There's an example of a tyrant with ancestors in the same vein. You have to look at their ancestors, meaning in a country that also has quite a tradition. But it's not something from 80 years ago, right? What happened with that man with the little mustache? No. The thing is, the German state is the main supporter of the genocidal state, the one with the star flag in the Middle East. What are you here to say? Freedom of the press, right? Quality journalism, right? Please, come on, we already know you, we've got you figured out, it's true, you're still deceiving a lot of people. But let time pass, let us see your true nature. And that day, maybe you'll have to run somewhere, because maybe popular justice will come. And it's harsh, it has no limits afterward. Enough already with lying to people. Now Trump is a tyrant? Don't tell me. Now Trump is a tyrant? But you've been licking that tyrant's boot your whole life. You're just, well, I'll say it, pardon what's coming.
You're
a bunch of losers. You've been submissive since 1945, never raising your voice, because you're a bunch of losers and cowards. I'm sorry, that's how it is. And go ahead, publish a little note from the elite of losers. That's it. Don't believe it? Well, go ahead, check what Der Spiegel is. Clearly a NATO mouthpiece, possibly the most pro-NATO magazine in Germany. And of course they say, well, so what if it's pro-NATO? NATO is dominated by the United States. Yes. And here we're going to try to explain a bit of what I think is happening. Because, of course, in the end, there are so many news stories, so many statements, and so on, that what gets reported is a confusing mess that's hard to understand, what the real keys are to what's going on.
Es difícil entender cuáles son las claves de lo que está ocurriendo. El conflicto en Ucrania está visto para sentencia.
The conflict in Ukraine is nearing its conclusion. We've been warning about this from the start, but naturally, the course we expected is now unfolding. A whole phase of NATO's energy being absorbed in the military theater. It has lasted 3.5 years. It could last 4.5, or 5, or however many. But there comes a point of rupture when it's no longer possible to sustain that war among the three sides, simply because they no longer have the capacity. Even more so if the United States pulls back a bit. So since that possibility no longer exists, and since what's visible on the horizon is a defeat, a full-fledged defeat, no matter how much they try to justify it, no.
Por mucho que lo intenten justificar, no, pero Putin pretendía ocupar toda Ucrania, sí, y llegar a Lisboa, ¿no?
But Putin intended to occupy all of Ukraine, yes, and reach Lisbon, and then cross the Atlantic, and have Russian tanks parade through Washington. Setting aside the nonsense from the usual Western media analysts, true intellectual beggars, professional liars, real vermin when it comes to deceiving the audience, what's actually happening? That defeat is something American analysts do see. Europeans see it too, but since the European political class is completely deranged, and because their own future, even on a personal level, is tied to the continuation of the war, they don't blame him. But in the White House, they've decided that what's happening in Ukraine is a symptom of what's happening globally, which is the shift in the geopolitical paradigm.
Que es el cambio de paradigma geopolítico, que se pasa del momento unipolar a
That we are moving from a unipolar moment to a new multipolar order, because there are emerging actors that now deal with the United States and the Anglo-Saxon powers as equals. So from that moment on, the hegemonic power, the United States, has to make a decision because three possible scenarios open up. The first, to fall into the Thucydides trap and go into a global conflict in an attempt to maintain its hegemony. The problem with that is, of course, one must recognize that its relative power has declined in comparison with the alliance of emerging powers, and it could lose. And of course, no one starts a war to lose it. And if it doesn't lose, how can it end?
Y si no pierde, ¿cómo puede acabar? Un holocausto nuclear.
In a nuclear holocaust. Everyone loses there. No one starts a war to lose it. Therefore, that scenario is unacceptable. What's the second scenario? Trying to keep things as they are now, but they know and are well aware that if things continue as they are, it will lead to the gradual decline of the hegemonic power itself. Why? Because of its economic exhaustion, its internal political polarization, many factors we've discussed in other programs, and a global resentment that exists, especially in the global South, against the foreign actions of the United States. And the fact we mentioned earlier, the seizure of a Venezuelan oil tanker bound for Venezuela, is clear proof of that. And, well, even some analysts, perhaps the more dramatic ones, are already talking about a civil war within the United States itself. Of course, that could lead to the collapse of the hegemonic power, and therefore that's not an acceptable scenario either. What other scenario is left for them? The remaining scenario is to adapt to that new situation, that new order, that multipolar paradigm. Of course, that also means accepting that you will no longer be the only power, the hegemonic power. You will have to share power. And in geopolitics, what does it mean to share power?
En la geopolítica, ¿qué es compartir el poder? Bueno, pues que va a haber áreas de influencia que van a pertenecer.
Well, there are going to be spheres of influence that will belong to, or be, let's say, added to other emerging powers. So what the hegemonic power will seek is to have the largest possible sphere of influence in order to sit at that table, even in that new G that Trump talks about. With whom? To sit with the powerful ones, with those that will really have to talk about many things and negotiate and so on, with China, with Russia, with India, with Japan, maybe a few others. Why? Because those are the ones who will truly be discussing in that new international order. To do that, it will have to look for a strategy of balance from the outside. That is, a balance of power with them. It will have to move toward reducing its comparative advantages. That is, it cannot continue with a financialized and purely speculative economy, because it sees that it is losing ground there. The other powers are productive, based on the real economy, and are also gradually trying to move away from the dollar as a reserve currency, which is what has allowed the United States to always maintain payment of its debt, and therefore sustain the living standards of its population, its defense budgets, its space program, and so on. And this means investing massively in education, research and development, technology, and infrastructure. And now it can't do that with the exorbitant expenses it has, for example, in defense. That exhaustion we were talking about, that imperial overextension with 850 bases spread around the world and so on, right? Well then, what does this administration think? That's what's reflected to some extent in the national security strategy. Basically, it means a kind of orderly withdrawal. To control the areas of influence it can actually control, and to negotiate the rules that will govern the world in the coming decades. With those I really have to negotiate with. The powers that can actually stand up to me. China, Russia, India, and so on. And what happens? Well, part of the elites disagree with this. What they want is to maintain hegemony at all costs. And that's where we find the Zionist and neocon sectors in the United States, the City of London, and the leadership in Brussels. So that's the contradiction we're seeing right now. There's a struggle, a clash within the dominant elites in the West. They are expressed on the one hand along that Brussels-London axis, with submarines and fifth columnists in Washington or in the United States, and with fifth columnists in the European Union, such as the governments of Italy, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, now possibly the Czech Republic. And we'll see what happens in Bulgaria, where the government has fallen due to popular pressure, because people don't want to join the euro, because everyone is starting to realize that the European Union is something that must be destroyed, dissolved, disarmed, because it's a danger to European citizens, a danger to European nations. And so, well, that clash among the elites is what we're seeing. That's what explains the different scenarios of conflict, of confrontation between the White House and London. Les tries to play there, to keep acting as an intermediary in that typically British game, I imagine with the intention of joining the winning side at the last moment. With that crazed Brussels, you only have to look at the relationships. Ursula von der Leyen, all the prime ministers and presidents of the European Union, except for the exceptions I've already mentioned. Not because some of them are thinking about that new order, but simply because they are Trump's allies, for example, Mrs. Maloney. And whatever Trump says is what they're going to do. But, well, that's how history is written, isn't it? I mean, there are allies who are so out of conviction, others because they are objective allies at a given moment, and then there are also the subtle fools, right? I mean, they're quite common too, the subtle fools. And this is what I really think we're living through right now. Where does this lead? It leads to the fact that, honestly, compared to the United States, the European Union is nothing. Nothing. First, because it has always been a vassal, moreover, of a particular kind, submissive to the point of humiliation, to the point of embarrassment, incapable of doing anything, of saying, I have something to say. It has lived off cheap Russian energy, Chinese manufacturing, which was also cheap, and the fact that the United States paid for security because it was in its interest, of course, to maintain control over Western Europe, which is an important market, and also a supplier of capital, a buyer of treasury bonds, part of the Rimland zone, strategically positioned against Russia, and so on. But he was the one paying for security, 70% of NATO, let's remember that. So now we have a European Union that thinks Trump is a tyrant, of course, and a traitor, right? He's left them on their own, poor things, all alone in the face of danger. A bunch of miserable, corrupt people. You have to see it to believe it. Not a day goes by without someone being arrested or a new case coming up or new suspicions arising. A gang of corrupt thieves, because all of that, in the end, comes out of the pockets of European workers. Absolutely insane policies. What have they led to? Well, the fact is that Europe right now is in a catastrophic situation, a catastrophe, where there is no democracy, where we have a demographic disaster, social chaos, disintegration, inequality, an economic crisis that they're now trying to cover up with an artificial rearmament to sustain a war that doesn't exist, one they'll try to keep low intensity to justify everything. But that can't escalate because, of course, if it turns into a nuclear war, it's all over. Deep down, it's all very delusional. Everything that comes out of Brussels is delusional. Everything that the people in Brussels, together with the group of European leaders in each country, do is simply to try to stay in power, to maintain the status quo, to preserve the situation that existed before the emergence of this multipolar world. And that's what we're living through. And this isn't because Trump thought, said, or reflected, no, we're going to be good. I'm going to adapt to the multipolar world, meaning I'll no longer be the greatest of all. In fact, the national security strategy explicitly rejects full-spectrum dominance, that is, the role of the United States as the sole guarantor of world order across the globe. Why? Because it can't anymore. Because it simply can't. And the only thing Trump has done is to accept that this is the reality and adjust in order to remain an influential power in the future. It's the only thing he's doing. We can't really blame him for that, mind you. It's what any governor would do. Well, I mentioned Trump because he's the one who comes to mind. I'm convinced Trump doesn't have the slightest clue about this. So they've put it on the table for him, and with that marker he uses that's as thick as a finger, he signs it, and that's it. I was saying yesterday that the Trump administration is basically the Employers Association of New York Real Estate Developers. There you have Wyckoff, Charles Campner, James Gagarin too. So, well, it's the real estate sector. Therefore, they understand very little about all this. But there must have been analysts in the State Department, in the Department of Defense, in the Pentagon, in the CIA, who told them, well, this is the situation, and we have to go this way, or we're really in danger. And Trump must have said, all right, then let's go this way. It's not a matter of kindness. It's not about good guys and bad guys or anything like that. It's simply because reality ends up imposing itself. And so in that paradigm shift, the United States has decided this. We're going to have to give up global hegemony. We're going to have to abandon the full spectrum dominance strategy. We're going to have to adopt flexible realism, where trade relations are prioritized. That's what interests him and what he knows about. We are going back to nation states, because that way I can deal on equal terms with sovereign nations, strengthen military power, since it's necessary to maintain your spheres of influence. What we're talking about is America, the Americas. And of course, since I can no longer do it alone, there has to be a sharing of burdens, and Europe must take on the costs of its own defense. And therefore, what's the diagnosis for Europe? for the European elites and those in London? Well, that Europe has become a threat to the United States because it doesn't want to go in that direction. And it's also undergoing a process of civilizational decline. As the security strategy document itself says, economic decline, low birth rates, uncontrolled migration, in short, a disaster. There is starting to be a clear ideological incompatibility between the dominant ideology and ruling classes in Brussels and London and the dominant ideology currently in Washington, even though there are fifth columnists on both sides. And well, it's not surprising then that the United States is talking about ending NATO's expansion, because if NATO expands, it leads to confrontation with Russia, with China, and to the Thucydides trap. To put an end to the conflict in Ukraine, because that is a sine qua non condition. And watch out for Europe to pay for its own security and for efforts to ensure that a majority of governments in Europe are more in line with Washington's dominant ideology. That is, Washington will try to support all populist governments that emerge, whether right-wing or left-wing, in Bulgaria, France, Germany, or the Netherlands. It's going to try to change those governments so that there are ones more inclined toward the dominant thinking in Washington right now. And that's more or less what we're seeing. Of course, from there, well, other scenarios could emerge, right? But ultimately, what this confirms is that the United States, as was to be expected, is beginning to accept that it's going to lose global hegemony. It will now have to set priorities, because it realizes its resources are finite. Look, if 30% of world trade stops being conducted in dollars, the United States can no longer pay the interest on its debt. That's how clear it is. And therefore, it enters an economic bankruptcy process that internally could mean social collapse.
Por aquí, Juan Antonio,
Over here, Juan Antonio, the publication Defense One, a magazine specializing in defense issues, presented this news yesterday or the day before. 2 leaked documents that apparently circulated through the White House before the release of the National Defense Strategy. 2 or 3 documents with more information, with a higher level of detail. One of them, or at least one, included the idea of making Europe great again, a clear reference to Make America Great Again, Donald Trump's campaign slogan, and a longer version of the national security strategy reviewed by Defense One.
Una versión más completa revisada por Defense One, esta publicación describe los planes de la administración Trump para deshacerse.
This publication describes the Trump administration's plans to get rid of old international relationships and create new ones. This longer version, which circulated before the White House released the declassified version, shares the main points: competition with China, withdrawal from European defense, and a new focus on the Western Hemisphere, basically the American continent. And here appears this idea of, let's make Europe great again. The G5 or C5, now they would call it Core 5, Center 5, instead of the G7, and a sort of renunciation of US hegemony. This would supposedly be the parent document from which the national security strategy would descend.
Estrategia de seguridad nacional. Y en cuanto a esto de hagamos que...
And regarding this "let's make Europe great again" idea, another publication covers it in more detail, the British Daily Mail. All of them are mouthpieces, well, of the Western mainstream press, but here they include an interesting map about Trump's alleged attempt to push these countries to leave. Poland, Hungary, Austria, Italy. Maybe we could add the Czech Republic with its new government, and Slovakia as well. How likely is this? How unlikely? And if this were really to happen, what would then be the fate of the European Union? Juan Antonio.
Look, as stated in the National Security Strategy document itself, what the White House wants are friendly governments in European nations. It knows that, in order to have a majority and change Brussels, that's not possible. Besides, corruption, regulation, and clashes with American companies have already reached extreme levels. In other words, Trump is also determined. It's already clear that Brussels has turned into a monster, that the best thing to do is to dissolve it. And on that point, we have to agree with him. That must be destroyed. But of course, the United States can't leave Europe. It just can't.
No se puede ir. Mira, ¿cómo se pasa del paradigma bipolar?
Look, how do we move from the bipolar paradigm of the Cold War to the unipolar paradigm in 1990, with the collapse of the Soviet Union? A geopolitical vacuum emerged. What did the United States do? It filled that vacuum. That made it the only superpower. That's why it was the hegemonic power. Because in geopolitics, as in nature, there can be no vacuum. Something will fill it. If the United States leaves Europe, who do you think will fill the gap? The economic gap, the development of technology, will China fill it? There was even the risk of re-establishing relations with Russia, of cheap Russian energy flowing again. No, you can't. The United States cannot allow that.
No puedes. Es decir, no, eso no lo puede hacer Estados Unidos. Entonces, no se puede ir de Europa. Pero claro, no puede estar.
You can't leave Europe, but of course you can't stay within a framework, a structure that is ideologically opposed, that serves other sectors of the ruling elites, and with which, as I said, there is no convergence, and which moreover is now practically unreformable. So what does he want? He wants to start breaking up that European Union. There are a number of governments, the Italian one. Why? Because Meloni is a Trumpist, possibly the Hungarian one because Orban is pro-Trump, possibly the Czech one, and maybe the Bulgarian one tomorrow. Fico, of course, would go along those lines, just as if AfD were to win in Germany tomorrow. Well, he would try. Why? To restore relations with Russia. But what he really wants is to dismantle that, because it no longer serves American interests. He prefers dealing with individual states, not with a structure that has proven unmanageable. And well, it's quite possible that this annex, whose reliability we don't know, to the national security strategy might simply be notes someone took during the meetings that were held. Or maybe, let's say, there's a secret annex. That is, the public version is the public version. A national security strategy with as many points as those seen in those 35 pages, I'm sure, must have several volumes of development where appropriate. Because that wasn't done by a single person. It was done by working teams, and they must have been working on it for weeks, if not months. Therefore, it's quite possible that some of these things are real, because they've been discussed, because they're parts that haven't been made public from what will be the complete document. Where does the European Union stand? Nowhere. Nowhere at all. But this is actually the best thing that could happen to us Europeans. That's the reality. And hey, sometimes God writes in crooked lines, right? Well, look, I don't care if it's Trump, Xi Jinping, or the Morning Star, but this has to end. Because the obsession with maintaining the status quo, with keeping the same dominant elites in place, leads us to war. Because that's the only thing that would allow them to survive. War to hide, as I said, the economic, social, and cultural disaster Europe is facing. War, so they can keep their profits, even if most of those profits go to the military-industrial complex.
Aunque la mayor parte de la ganancia va al complejo militar industrial, pero norteamericano, pero siempre queda algo aquí.
But something always remains here, because surely everyone is involved in the corruption. Everyone. And of course, faced with that situation, it's better to keep things as they are. And if tomorrow the United States and Russia reach an agreement, topple the Kiev regime, and the war in Ukraine ends, they'll look for some provocation to keep people living in fear. Besides, that would allow for population control, repression, the elimination of fundamental rights. Well, I wasn't going to say suppression, no. Suppression would mean falsifying democracy. That's what it would allow. Political parties would be banned, and TV channels and media outlets would be shut down.
Cerrarían canales y medios de comunicación. Perseguirían a la gente. por sus opiniones en las redes sociales.
They would go after people for their opinions on social media, as is already happening. All of this is already happening. It's already happening. Let's not fool ourselves about that. I mean, the European Union has already become an enemy of the people. Absolutely. And therefore, what needs to be done is to dismantle it. The problem with dismantling it, meaning here, what could happen in Europe? That's the question. What could happen in Europe? Well, either a controlled dismantling takes place, and it's brought under the new directives of the one who has been the master until now, which is the White House, or we head toward a chaotic fragmentation whose outcome is very uncertain, but not a good one.
O vamos a una fragmentación caótica que no sabemos dónde puede acabar, pero no muy bien. La tercera opción sería repensar.
The third option would be to rethink the Paris-Berlin-Moscow alliance and return to a situation like the network era, to re-establish relations with the multipolar world, with China, to have cheap goods and raw materials coming in again, to have cheap energy coming in again, and well, to accept that you'll have to spend a bit more on security. What for? If you've already secured your eastern borders and so on, what for? Are you going to go to war with India, with Pakistan, or with the United States? You're not. Therefore, there would be no need for a €1 trillion rearmament plan either. That is to say, we know that at this point, it's very, very difficult to even consider that, right?
And among Europeans, Juan Antonio, because one of the risks of the United States withdrawing from Europe is the return of intra-European wars. To a large extent, post-war European security depended on the existence of the United States as the guarantor of everyone's safety. Since the United States was the power ensuring everyone's security, the youngsters, let's call them that, referring to Rutte, had daddy, puppy, the United States. The youngsters below kept in check and not fighting among themselves. But if daddy leaves the continent, couldn't Germany and the United Kingdom start up their old ways again?
They could, but for that to happen, Europe would have to move toward a United States of Europe. And that's not going to happen. It can't, because China would take over immediately. So that can't happen. Therefore, as I said, yes, it will continue to be a vassal of the United States, but, well, they'll be smaller vassals. And obviously, what the United States will not allow is for European countries to start arguing again over Alsace-Lorraine, Bohemia and Moravia, Savoy or Gibraltar, right? So it won't allow that, and we'll try to maintain that control and that vassalage. But yes, that is made up of nation-states with governments that are more controllable from Washington. Or at least, not that I mean controllable in a pejorative sense now, but that actually allow for a bilateral relationship. And it's much easier for Washington to deal with Orban or Maloney or with the President of the Czech Republic than to have to deal with Brussels, which immediately gets carried away with the idea that it represents 400 or 500 million inhabitants. It's all smoke, of course.
Here are Merz's words on the matter. And by the way, we have almost 2,000 followers connected and fewer than 1,000 likes. Please help us fight censorship by giving a thumbs up. Here's Merz talking about Trump. It's in German, but just a bit further down. Well, the journalist's question: how should your statements be understood in this context? That if Americans no longer want to cooperate with Europe, they should at least maintain cooperation with Germany. Merz replies, well, it's simple. I pointed out that, obviously, in Washington, the European Union is not well understood as an institution. During my visit in June, I tried to explain to Trump the history of the European Union and its founding. However, the US government finds it very difficult to understand this European Union as a union of states. For my part, I understand it, because what we are doing on the European side is unique. There has never been anything like it in history, in the international community, never anything like it in the world. And if the US government is having trouble engaging in dialogue with this institution, the European Union, then I said that at least it should talk with each of the member states, including, of course, Germany. We have traditionally maintained good relations with the United States, and I am willing to speak with the US government on behalf of other Europeans and address these issues that we must deal with together for the benefit of the freedom and security of our continent. And in another press conference, I also remember this gentleman's words when he was asked about the new security strategy. He said, "This security strategy that the Americans published last week is not a big surprise. After the US Vice President's speech at the Munich Security Conference, which everyone has probably heard and remembers. Therefore, we are prepared for a change in the transatlantic relationship, but I still want to see the United States as a partner, in the same way it views its perspective toward Europe and also toward Germany." Well,
Todo mentira. Todo mentira.
All lies, every single thing. I didn't tell a single truth.
No hice una sola verdad.
now, are you somehow acknowledging that, at least from the US side, they no longer want anything to do with the European Union?
Claro, eso es evidente. Eso es evidente. A ver,
Of course, that's obvious. That's obvious. Let's see. We already talked about it. The problem is that this is in an official document. I mean, it's not one of Trump's blustering, boastful tweets. This is in an official document. And therefore, those are the guidelines that the State Department, the Department of Defense, the Treasury Department, the Department, all of them will have to follow. The intelligence services, the Pentagon. This is not a tweet. Therefore, it has to carry some weight. Now then, it's clear indeed that right now the US administration has realized that the European Union has already turned into an unmanageable monster. The unfortunate thing is that many European citizens still haven't realized it, and they keep believing in the European Union. That's what's so regrettable, that they've already understood it in Washington. Even Trump has understood it, and he's not exactly bright, yet many European citizens still haven't. Perfect. Merz doesn't say a single damn truth. He's a real rat, I'll say it like that, because he's a man from BlackRock. But what sovereignty is he talking about? As if it were something real. Germany has been occupied since 1945. It has no sovereignty at all. It has no constitution. There's a basic law of Bonn imposed by the occupiers, the Americans. What sovereignty? It's got 35,000 American soldiers stationed there, in a bunch of bases, even with nuclear weapons. What sovereignty is he talking about? What nonsense is this guy saying? With that cape, he looks like Bartolo. Please, we're prepared. We already knew. Are we prepared? What are you prepared for? You want to tell me. What are you prepared for? You don't have a penny. You want to steal Russian funds because you don't even have enough to keep supporting Ukraine. You don't have a penny for anything. What are you prepared for? You're going to bring back mandatory military service because I think you're already afraid there might be social unrest. Since tens of thousands of German workers are being thrown out on the damn street because you've lost your industry. Because you and your predecessors and the rest of your political class are such cowards that you kept your mouths shut like miserable people after the Nord Stream explosion, where cheap energy used to come from. What are you saying, man? What is this man saying? It's disgraceful. And he calls the United States a partner. What a partner. What a partner.
Pero qué socio. Qué socio. Si él manda y tú obedeces.
He gives the orders and you obey. He gives the orders and you obey. You and the rest of the gang that meet up in Brussels. Trump gives the orders and you all obey because you have no sovereignty at all, nor any shame for keeping this status quo alive. Of course, if things change, maybe you'll stop being there. You, little Ursula, and you'll stop playing dumb here and there. And your arms industries. Of course, your puppet eco-capitalism. with a welfare system that's sinking, values that no longer exist. No one believes in them anymore. I mean, please, I think we've already crossed the point of no return.
Yo creo que se ha cruzado ya el punto de no retorno. La Unión Europea camina hacia la irrelevancia.
The European Union is heading toward irrelevance, and from irrelevance it will move to fragmentation, and from fragmentation it will move to dissolution. And I say again, that's the best thing that could happen to the peoples of Europe. Even if we go back to national states, to, well, once again arguing among ourselves about a bunch of things like, well, how agricultural products can reach Germany, French farmers getting upset, and so on. Fine, all that will happen. It will probably happen again. But the European Union is a failed project. It's already a failed project. It's not going any further. It was something imposed from the outside.
Ya era una cosa impuesta desde fuera, de todos los padres de la Unión Europea, ¿quiénes? Schuman, De Gasperi, Adenauer.
All the founding fathers of the European Union, Schuman, De Gasperi, Adenauer, were all put in place by the United States, with London's complicity. So where are you going to go now? No, come on. This is starting to smell like decay. It's starting to fall apart. And obviously, look, these processes, there might come a moment when it all collapses completely. But until that happens, we'll start seeing crises, fragmentation, and a rise in the representation of Eurosceptic, populist, and similar parties. That's what's going to keep happening. Simply because, as with everything, the public can't take it anymore. It's already clear what this is going to become. And no, that's not the way. They're not up for it.
Y no está por ahí. No está por ello. Y en Washington, que ya lo han visto también.
And in Washington, where they've already seen it too, they say, very well, let's support friendly governments and parties. And those friendly parties, as you know, will be the ones that most align with the dominant ideology in Washington right now, which is an ideology of part of the ruling classes, opposed to another faction of the ruling classes whose center is in London and Brussels. And we're going to see clashes between the fifth columnists on one side and the other, the neocons and the most hardline Zionists. And here, far-right governments that at some point will say, no, we're going to see that.
Gobiernos de extrema derecha que en un momento digan, no vamos, esto lo vamos a ver.
Y la OTAN en todo esto, Juan Antonio.
And NATO in all this, Juan Antonio, in this whole reconfiguration. Here are Rutte's words. Pay attention to this, because even within Rutte's own parameters, these words are already out of bounds.
Our grandparents and great-grandparents endured. Imagine it. A conflict.
Imagine a conflict that reaches every home, every workplace.
Claro, este es el discurso. A ver.
Of course, this is the speech. Let's see, there's fear. Why? Because there's a reason for fear, the Russian threat. And this leads us to war. The war that he says will be felt in every household. Let's see, how can a household in Lisbon feel the war, that threat? How? Because nuclear missiles start falling on it, that's one thing. Or because the situation in Europe becomes unbearable. And then come tax hikes, unemployment, deindustrialization, disaster, social disintegration. And then, of course, we're already at war. Because if there's unemployment, it will also be Putin's fault. Just like the swine fever in Spain, it's also Putin's fault. Everything will be Putin's fault, because Russia is a threat.
Porque Rusia es una amenaza, ¿no? Entonces, hay que mantener ese discurso del miedo. Esto que nos indica
that fear-based narrative must be maintained. This shows the desperation among the elites of that NATO sector, made up of countries other than the United States. Rutte, being European, tries to maintain a position aligned with whom? With Brussels, with London, and with the North American neocon sector. And he's starting to play that game. But one thing is clear. If the United States begins to deal with countries one by one, and to make defensive agreements, arms deals, and similar arrangements, NATO will cease to have, well, it's heading down the same path as the European Union. This happens because, simply by the United States deciding not to pay its 70%, NATO is left with nothing. Because it was always nothing. It was always the Yankees. It was always nothing. So, well, it will go back to what it always was. Nothing. Meanwhile, imagine what it will be like when those United States, already thinking about that multipolar world that G5 apart from Europe, decide to establish commercial and strategic relations with Russia. Because we must remember what the national security strategy says, to seek strategic stability with Russia. That will mean, well, putting an end to NATO's expansion. That will mean NATO will face a crisis, but above all for one reason, because it will no longer make sense.
Porque deja de tener sentido. Es que Rutte cuando habla intenta dar.
The thing is, when Rutte speaks, he tries to give meaning to the institution he represents, because he doesn't actually preside over anything. Deep down, he's a nobody. We're talking about a man who, when he walks into a NATO room, the air conditioning shuts off. Nobody even comes in. I mean, come on, he's just a spokesperson, like Stoltenberg was. But he must think he's important. All of them think they're very important, starting with the Spanish Prime Minister and ending with anyone else. They all think they're incredibly important, but really, together they don't matter at all. Nothing. Yet they think they're something, don't they?
Speaking of nonsense, or rather contradictions, here's an interesting compilation from the people at El Ojo about who wants to attack whom. Because, on one hand, apparently the Russians want to bomb Europe tomorrow, but I also remember these statements. Pay attention.
Defeat is not a bad thing because you would
Defeat is not a bad thing because we would have more, like in small nations. It's not a bad thing if the great power is much smaller.
A few moments later.
A couple of moments later, he stops before attacking one of us. Vladimir Putin is moving against NATO here. Russia has been an existential threat to us Europeans, and we must reassess it. So we are all live against the Russians.
Well, on one hand, they want Russia to break up into several states, into several countries. But on the other hand, the bogeyman is Russia.
Exactly.
Now, beyond that, Juan Antonio, Trump would ultimately be responding to the expectations created during his campaign in this way, with many twists and turns, with contradictions, but in the end, he would be generating that movement of withdrawal from the European stage, a confrontation framed as competition with China, not a direct clash, and a tougher stance in the Americas. It's what we predicted at the beginning, or before his administration started, but later, amid so many back and forths, yes and no, it turned into more of a jumble of things than a clear strategy. But this apparently would in some way be correcting the course. Well, his America First thesis was precisely that, America First.
Is going to make America great again. The slogan, Make America Great Again, is an implicit acknowledgement that right now it's no longer as great as it once was, and that it needs to become great again. It was an admission that, indeed, the situation was no longer that of the United States in the 1990s or the 1950s, when World War II ended. So, of course, it's clear that Trump came from a more traditional American political line, one more focused on legislation, on protecting national interests, and on domestic policy. In fact, the whole idea of trying to get companies to produce again in the United States, to reindustrialize, to become a productive country again, rather than one driven by stock market speculation, some people just lose their minds when the NASDAQ goes up. It's a bloody mess. I mean, in the end, what really matters is how much steel you can produce in a year, because that determines how many cars you can make, the machines and tools you can produce, the weapons you can manufacture, the bridges you can build. No, some people go crazy over the NASDAQ and talk nonsense. Sure, that supposedly shows a powerful economy, while we all keep believing in the system that's been set up. But the thing is, I'm afraid some people are already thinking about that new Bretton Woods, trying to figure out how we can organize the economy for the coming decades. And for that, we need to become productive again, to have a real economy again. And yes, that idea is part of Donald Trump's electoral platform. What did he find afterward? Well, that what you promise during elections is one thing, and putting it into practice is another. You realize that half the people around you are traitors, sold out to the enemy, but you have to put up with them because otherwise they won't let you govern. So first you rely on some, then you have to rely on others. You have to put up with the whole Zionist issue because you have no other choice. Because even Zionists have had their time, and although it eventually ended, Trump is also sympathetic to the issue. But even if he weren't, he'd have to tolerate it, because otherwise they'd bring him down. He wouldn't be able to govern. All it takes is for 2 Republican senators to decide to mess with him, change their vote in the Senate, and he can't get his laws passed. It's a very delicate matter. Trump, the President of the United States, doesn't actually have as much power as it seems. Look at what has happened with the Federal Reserve. It hasn't been able to get rid of Jerome Powell. He couldn't do it, even being the President of the United States. In other words, it's embarrassing how the whole thing turned out. He'll have to wait until Powell's term ends, now in February, to be able to replace the head of the Reserve. So of course all this leads to a chaotic situation, which is what we've seen from January until now. Chaos in the U.S. administration. I don't think it's going to be resolved in the coming months, because the problem is still there. And in fact, this national security strategy has a problem, seeing to what extent those on his team and his subordinates actually follow it, how capable they are of carrying out that direction without deceiving him, betraying him, or twisting the meaning of things. Because this already happened during Trump's first term. Remember that whole bunch of traitors to Trump, not to me or to Ezekiel, to Trump, right? Elliot Abrams, Mike Pompeo, John Bolton, all those guys who were neocons. And it didn't matter. They lied to Trump. And no matter what Trump said, they were going to do what their masters told them to do. And who were their masters? The Zionists, the military-industrial complex, and so on. Kind of like what happened during Bush's time with the oil and arms industries, right?
Yes, we should. And we should also focus on the inertia of the imperial monster, right? Because even if Trump really wanted to bring about a change of that kind, and beyond all the possible contradictions within Trump himself, just to recall one, they still want the subordination of Latin America, and particularly of Venezuela. But they themselves, through their policy of hostility toward Venezuela, caused Venezuela to shift toward China, and now Venezuela exports about 80% of its oil to China, whereas until 2014, it basically traded everything with the United States, even under Chavez. Because Chavez, with great dignity, upheld a line of sovereignty, but economically, he was characterized by pragmatism. If the deal was good for Venezuela, he sold the oil to the United States.
If they come and buy your oil, and on top of that they pay you a good price, obviously.
Of course, well, the United States brought about that change, which means that sometimes even within Trump's line, there are contradictions. But anyway, beyond that, let's remember the inertia. And speaking of inertia, the difficulty of steering this giant ship called the United States. Here's something. This, by the way, courtesy of our friendly Telegram channel, Wars and Geopolitics. Thanks to the friends from that channel. Don't miss it. In my opinion, one of the best Spanish-language channels on geopolitics on Telegram. Here we have Amanda Sloat, the US official in charge of European policy during the Biden administration, and the friends Vovan and Lexus, those clever Russians known for their prank calls, somehow managed to reach her, tricked her in some way, and she began one after another with confessions about the disaster in Ukraine, caused by not having validated Ukraine's neutrality regarding NATO, as demanded by Russia.
Here are her words. Pay attention. This is worth hearing, with subtitles. At that moment, she could have handled it well. She was uncomfortable with the idea of the United States imposing on Ukraine not to do that, and that, impulsively, Russia would be given some kind of sphere of influence or veto power over the matter. There is certainly a question. What was Biden's position at that time? Yes, to test my memory. But I don't think Biden felt it was his place to tell Ukraine what to do then, to tell Ukraine not to pursue NATO membership. So my question is, could we have avoided a situation like this? Or did we make a mistake somewhere along the way?
Alternative version of history, one option would have just been for Ukraine to say in...
Yeah, I think if you want to make an alternative version of history, one option would be that Ukraine said in December 2022, all right, we're not going to join NATO, we'll stay neutral. Ukraine could have made a deal, I guess, in March or April 2022, around the time of the Istanbul talks. I know there were different views among our military leaders then about the counteroffensive. I think during the Biden administration, that's been Ukraine's big hope, to regain territory and be able to negotiate a better deal. That didn't happen the way anyone wanted. And I think there are different arguments in the United States and in Ukraine about why it didn't work.
About why that didn't work out.
Like the little wolf from the cartoons, with his jaw dropped, like this, pop. All confessed, Juan Antonio. Poor thing, all confessed.
Everything. This lady is responsible for more than 1 million deaths. Someday history, of course, will deliver justice. And if the Almighty exists, I hope He will too, and that she rots in hell for all eternity. Because she is one of those responsible for that 1 million deaths. The good thing about these kinds of statements, thanks to those Russian pranksters who make these kinds of calls, some say they're FSB agents, is that since everyone is a Russian agent now, it's no longer news. But it wasn't because it was unknown. Of course, many of us who speak through alternative channels had said it from day one. It confirms what happened in Istanbul, which some idiot still denies. Some idiot who appears on certain TV channels still denies it. Fine, but the thing is, sometimes we just don't pay attention, and with so many things happening, our memory fails us. Memory is always fragile. But we only need to remember Stoltenberg, a statement from Stoltenberg. I recall that indeed, there was a serious formal attempt, with an actual document in December 2021, addressed to the White House in Brussels, to sign a collective security treaty that would keep Ukraine neutral and thus avoid the coming conflict, because Russian intelligence had already perfectly identified and studied how the Ukrainians were going to launch an offensive, especially in the Donbass. And Stoltenberg said, verbatim, I quote, "The background to all of that was that President Putin declared in the fall of 2021 that, remember that the military operation began in February 2022. And in fact, he sent a draft treaty that they wanted NATO to sign, promising that it would not expand any further. That's what he sent us, and it was a precondition for not invading Ukraine. Of course, we didn't sign that. The opposite happened. He wanted us to sign that promise never to expand NATO again. He wanted us to remove our military infrastructure from all the allied countries that had joined NATO since 1997. That is, half of NATO, what they had promised Gorbachev and Yeltsin. All of Central and Eastern Europe. We should remove NATO from that part of our alliance, introducing some kind of second-class membership, that is, countries that could belong to NATO but not have offensive weapons. We rejected that. So Russia went to war to prevent more NATO, from getting closer to its borders. And now it has exactly the opposite. Because as you know, Finland and Sweden later joined NATO in an act of irresponsibility by their peoples, who are already paying the price, especially the Finns. But anyway, we knew it, we were aware of it, they had said it. I mean, they didn't even hide it. Another thing is that this isn't a daily news topic for the media jaws of Western corporate outlets, right? That's true. And if at some point something was read or said, well, since memory is fragile, we start to forget. And this lady has only come to confirm everything we already knew, to confirm it. Indeed. And she's right. If this had been said in January 2021, right now the European Union wouldn't be destroyed. More than 1 million young people and others wouldn't have died. There wouldn't be 6 or 8 million refugees. The Nord Stream wouldn't have been destroyed. Europe wouldn't have been deindustrialized. And this wouldn't be the disaster that Biden and his gang, the vermin in Brussels and the den in London, have led us to. Where I believe all the smoke from hell gathers, and it must smell of sulfur from the channel. And, well, now we have what we have. And fine, we've reached this point, we've talked about it on this program, and that's it, folks. European guys, I don't know.
Señores, chicos europeos, no sé. A ver, ¿qué hacemos ahora?
So, what do we do now? The last point along the same lines, not to make an analysis, but simply as proof that unfortunately many of those responsible, or actually more than many, practically all of those responsible for these atrocities generally don't answer for them. Unfortunately, just as Bush Jr., Bush the son, didn't answer for the atrocities in Iraq, nor did Obama for the 7 wars, well, even less so Biden and so on. And Clinton, with Yugoslavia.
Clinton with Yugoslavia, Bush Sr. for the first Gulf War. No, we could go on like this until...
Here's Dmytro Kuleba, remember Kuleba, also known at one point as Kulebra, the Ukrainian Minister of Foreign Affairs, famous for his smoking scenes. This is an interview conducted, once again, many thanks to the colleagues from the Telegram channel Wars and Geopolitics. This is an interview on Ukrainian television.
Esta es una entrevista en la televisión ucraniana. Atención a las preguntas y las respuestas.
Pay attention to this official's questions and answers.
Всім, що ми записуємо...
Ми в Києві. На Хрещатику 44.
Да. І прийде повістка, я ж,
And when the draft notice arrives, I'm not going to run away from the border. I lived 2.5 years of my life in the war, from the very first night when no one believed they would stop us. I'm not going to run away. I'm home, and again, I won't volunteer, because I've already spent 2.5 years in the war. But I won't flee to avoid mobilization. When the time comes, I won't.
What a nerve.
What a nerve. Say it, say it. This man is living like a king in the United States right now.
Here's your company the other day at an event. Juan Antonio, pay attention to this.
Nothing. Well, nothing. The problem is that obviously all the rotten journalism doesn't show this on the news or on a front page for you to see. This is the Kiev regime. This is what the European Union and London support. A bunch of shameless people who got rich by stealing money from Ukrainians, from the rest of the Europeans, and from Americans too. And now they live a life of luxury in the United States, just as it should be. So the fools can think twice about it.
No quiero cometer...
No, I don't want to. I don't want in any way to defend the Azov Nazis. But the Azov Nazis are more consistent. At least they're there. because at least they take part. They, Nazis, well, they want a Nazi regime, and they take part physically, fighting in the name of the Nazis. These comrades on stage, these mercenaries, none of them take part at the front, not even voluntarily, obviously not. This man. Oh yes, I'm waiting for the summons. The summons will surely reach the entire Ukrainian people before it reaches him. Obviously, everything is arranged.
Ucraniano antes de la llegada de la citación a él, obviamente todo arreglado. El otro día Yermak también, después de la...
The other day, Yermak also started answering questions after being dismissed. Oh well, maybe now I'll go take part at the front. And some people replied, of course, that way he wants to get himself cleared of all the corruption charges, but obviously he's not going to take part in any front. These sons of bitches don't take part in anything. They send off the sons of the poor, their children, fathers and grandfathers in this case, right? What filth! What disgust! What disgust! Juan Antonio, the floor is yours for the closing. Say whatever you want for the wrap-up, Juan Antonio.
Lo que quieras para el cierre, Juan Antonio.
No, muy sencillo. Yo creo que estamos en un momento...
No, very simple. I think we're at a moment when we need to pay attention to what's going to happen in the coming weeks. We've said it before, but honestly, it's getting more and more intense. We're at a point where we have to see what happens. Is the so-called peace plan going to move forward? Is it going to be delayed? Zelensky's nonsense about calling for, I want a ceasefire to hold elections in 90 days. He thinks the world is stupid. Now we're supposed to stop everything so you can rig an election in 90 days. No, I think things, as I said before, have reached a point of no return. And it's going to be interesting because things will start to take shape and they're going to affect U.S. politics, what might happen in the Caribbean, European politics, and what happens in Ukraine. And that's going to determine what happens in the coming months up until those midterm elections in the United States. In those elections, well, if Trump manages to show some successes, he might get through them just fine. If not, the Trump administration will be over and the chaos will intensify. So we'll see. But one thing's for sure, European citizens remain in the same situation. That's why I have respect and admiration for the Bulgarians, who managed, through street pressure, to bring down a government that wanted to force the euro on them no matter what, simply because it suited them as part of the dominant entities in Brussels. My respect to the Bulgarians, but to the rest of the European citizens I say, either we start taking this seriously, or things are going to go very badly for us. Very badly.
Demolishers, thank you so much for joining us. Beatriz Pulido, our moderator, as always, 1,000 thanks. We've reactivated memberships for channel members who support us every month. In many cases, membership cancellation notices appeared, but that was due to a technical issue. We've already fixed it, so you can start your memberships again. Join us on our sister channel, MP Geopolitics, and on our English language channel. Any English-speaking friends can share our talks, which are translated and dubbed into Spanish using artificial intelligence. Dear Juan Antonio, a hug and see you soon.
See you soon. Best regards to everyone.